The house was still breathing, though the world had long forgotten it. Wind moved through its cracked bones, wooden ribs groaning under the weight of time and dust. The ceiling hung low, blistered with moisture, its veins of mold pulsing like memory refusing to die. Somewhere inside, a clock ticked slow, uneven, a ghost of rhythm in a place that had stopped keeping time. Silence pressed against the walls, heavy and damp, the kind that carries the echo of something once alive. Outside, the horizon burned faintly, the last color bleeding out of a Texas dusk. He stood in the doorway, the investigator, though the word felt wrong now, too clean for what he was becoming. His name was Daniel Kerr, and the file in his hand had yellowed to the color of regret. The girl's name, Marisol Vale, lingered in his mouth like a confession. 17 when she vanished in '99, last seen near the disused gas station on County Road 13. Every report said the same. No witnesses, no struggle, just absence, clean and quiet, as if the earth had swallowed her whole. He looked at the walls, blistered paint curling like old skin, and felt her presence somewhere beneath it. The air smelled of iron and rot. A half-burned photo lay in the corner, half-face of a girl smiling towards something out of frame. Marisol. Her eyes were unflinching, even through the ash. He didn't move for a long time. He just listened to the settling boards, to the whisper of dust in the air, to the sound of his own heart pushing against a memory he'd buried years ago. When he finally spoke, it was to no one. 13 years, he murmured, and still. The house swallowed his words whole. 2. Old disappearance resurfaces after discovery of symbolic object. It began again the way endings sometimes do, by accident. A boy scavenging through junk behind the old diner found a locket, half buried in the dirt, its chain tangled with roots. Inside, 2 photographs faced one another like mirrors, a young girl's portrait, Marisol Vale, and a smaller image, torn at the edge, of someone else. Someone Daniel recognized. The object was handed over to local authorities, logged and forgotten in the evidence queue, until Daniel saw the report cross his desk. His pulse flickered. The initials carved on the back, DK plus MV, were the same ones he had once carved into a wooden bench behind the high school. Long before he became the man who investigates missing girls. Long before guilt became his vocation. He drove that night without calling anyone, headlights cutting through a landscape of weeds and rusted billboards. Every mile marker felt like a question he could no longer avoid. When he reached the diner's remains, just a concrete shell, the ghost of neon clinging to the wind, he saw the locket's hole in the ground, small and black, like the entrance to memory itself. Kneeling there, Daniel pressed his hand to the dirt. The soil was cold and damp, as if it had been freshly turned, though no one had touched it in years. He thought of her, Marisol, in the summer sun, her laughter brittle, always a little too bright. He thought of the fight they'd had that night, the words he'd thrown like knives. And then the silence that followed. When he stood up, his fingers were stained with mud and something darker. His reflection in the diner's shattered window looked back, older, fractured, unrecognizable. He whispered her name. And for a moment, the wind answered. 3 investigator shows personal involvement, mixing duty with obsession. Daniel's office was a mausoleum of cases, but hers, Marisol Vale, missing person, 1999, lay open like a wound. Every photograph, every witness statement, every scrap of rumor pinned, crossed, underlined, a constellation of failure orbiting his desk lamp's dying light. He told himself this was professional, that reopening the case was procedural, objective, but his hands trembled when he touched the files. He hadn't been an investigator back then, just a boy who left her waiting at the fairground while he drank with friends, who returned to find her gone. He remembered the smell of popcorn and diesel, the flickering carousel lights turning red against the night. How her laughter had carried, then stopped. He lit another cigarette, though the air was already thick with them. Smoke curled through the lamplight like fog over a graveyard. The photograph of the locket sat beside the ashtray, gleaming faintly, like a heartbeat under glass. He began to dream of her again. Not as she was, but as she might have been, her voice echoing through the walls of his apartment, soft, accusing. "You forgot me," she said. He woke to find her file open on his chest, the words case reopened scrawled in his own handwriting. Days blurred. He began driving to the site nightly, parking near the gas station ruins, headlights off. Sometimes he thought he saw her, a shape moving between the trees, a flicker of white against the dark. Once he followed, calling her name. The ground gave way under him, and he fell to his knees beside a patch of disturbed earth. He dug with his hands until dawn, until the skin broke and the earth turned red. He found nothing. Only the sound of his own breath, ragged and small. By sunrise, Daniel knew two things. The case was his again, and he was no longer sure he wanted it solved. They gathered like small storms around the absence. Not many, just enough to make the silence heavy with specificity. Isla Vale, Marisol's mother, wore grief like a second spine that kept her upright while hollowing her out. Time had thinned her voice into a brittle thread. She lived in a tract house at the edge of town where the mesquite scraped the windows in the wind, as if asking to be let in. On her mantel, a shrine, a school portrait with the glossy smile of a girl trying to look older than 17, a quinceañera ribbon, a plastic rosary with a snapped crucifix. When Daniel visited, Isla's eyes lingered on his hands before they dared rise to his face, as if fingerprints could confess. "You were her friend," she said once, not accusing, not forgiving, just numbing the fact like a scar. He nodded and watched the dust move through the afternoon light, a slow galaxy turning over the frame of Marisol's photo. Lulu Garza kept the diner running years after the neon died. She remembered everything in fragments. Marisol had a laugh that sounded like a bottle cap spinning, and sometimes in prophecies, trouble travels in pairs. Lulu had given Marisol shifts that summer of '99, letting her wipe down counters and pocket nickels. In the calendar hung behind the register, the squares for August were blank except for a single word scrawled in a younger Lulu's hand: gone. When Daniel brought the locket, Lulu's fingers traced the initials and trembled just once. "Boys carve promises like they carve trees," she murmured, "and forget both when the beer is cold." Deputy Me Alvarez was the only one who still believed in Daniel as an investigator and not as a man orbiting his own failure. Fresh badge, quiet stubbornness. She, grown up in the shadow of the case, to her, Marisol was both cautionary tale and hometown myth. "If you reopen it," Me said, "do it to finish it, not to bleed." She watched him from the doorway of his office, taking note of the insomnia in his posture, the soil beneath his nails. Sometimes she followed his car at night and parked a block away from wherever he parked. Church lots, the shuttered fairground, County Road 13. Pretending she was keeping him safe when she was really measuring the radius of his obsession. Reverend Cole threaded the community together on Sundays with a voice that could turn a gossip into a confession, and a confession into absolution. He had married Daniel once, baptized his daughter, led candlelit prayers the summer Marisol vanished. He was excessive in his kindness and economical with his past. When Daniel asked about '99, Cole closed his office door and spoke in careful ellipses. She came by the church from time to time looking for quiet. Girls like that. They carry radiance and target signs in the same body. We don't always know which one we're seeing. He folded his hands, pastoral, practiced. Daniel watched the cuff of a shirt too clean for a man who handled the sorrow of a town. He remembered a rumor, or invented it. Memory builds scaffolds where there is no house, that Marisol had once sung a solo at youth choir and then never came back. There was also the brother, Thomas Kerr, 2 years younger, who used to ride in the back of Daniel's car and imitate his laugh. Now he ran a junkyard out past the tracks, a field of stripped frames and broken doors that clanged when the wind turned. Thomas had been at the fair that night. He remembered popcorn, diesel, the carousel, pieces. He remembered Daniel drinking. He remembered Marisol waiting with the patience of someone who had waited before. When Daniel asked again, Thomas shrugged into silence like a coat. "All I know," he said at last to the metal horizon of his yard, "is you drove away without her." The words were not a verdict. They were a toll. Each of them tilted the room toward a different gravity. Isla's grief dragged the story back to the kitchen table. Lulu's fragments arranged themselves into a mosaic Daniel couldn't stop reading. Me's vigilance cast a thin light over his darkest drives. The Reverend's gentle rhetoric turned every path into a confession. Thomas's quiet compacted the earth around Daniel's memory until the shovel hit rock. The case narrowed into a handful of faces and the spaces between them, where what could be said got lost in what could not. In those spaces, Daniel felt the cold breath of the house on County Road 13, the way it seemed to listen when no one else would. He wrote their names on yellow slips and pinned them to a map of places that weren't places anymore: diner, fairground, church, junkyard, the old gas station. He drew red thread between them and then cut it with a pocket knife at midnight, as if severing lines might quiet the humming in his skull. It didn't. Threads reattached themselves when he slept. He woke with string marks on his fingers as though the map had bound him. "Tell me the truth," he said once in Isla's doorway, and she looked past him to a night that refused to unclench. "Which one?" she asked, and left the porch light on as he walked back to his car alone. 5. Symbolic clues, photos, diary, patterns build intellectual intrigue. The clues came like condensation on a mirror, appearing only long enough for him to press his finger into them, leaving prints that smeared any certainty. First, the Polaroids from the fairground, found inside a shoebox in the junkyard office where Thomas kept receipts and old baseball cards. A teenager's constellation of images, tilted horizons, half smiles, blurred lights like comets, some of them marked with a felt-tip X. In one, the carousel caught mid-turn is a red smear. In the foreground, a pair of hands extended, palms up, as if asking to be read. Another captures Marisol laughing with her head thrown back, the kind of laughter that swallows the world and returns it changed. On the reverse, in small crabbed print, "I'm not a picture." Daniel held that card a while. The letters looked rushed, like someone writing before a storm arrives. Then the diary page, torn clean from a spiral notebook and tucked inside a hymnal at the church, found because me, bored during a community meeting, fidget-flipped the pages and something slipped. The paper had been pressed long enough to ghost the ink onto the hymn opposite. He wants me to be his mirror, the entry reads, so he can practice loving himself. No names. An hour noted in the margin, 9:13. The number hissed in Daniel's head. 13 again. He remembered the county road, the year, the file number. He remembered the bench at the high school where he carved initials and then left the shavings for the janitor to sweep. Patterns breed themselves when the mind is hungry. At Lulu's diner, beneath a loose tile behind the register, me found a brass token from the old carousel, oxidized to a green that looked almost tender. Stamped on one side, "Ride once, remember always." On the other, the number 13 in a font that trembled at the edges with age. Lulu swore she didn't know it was there. "Things sink," she said, tapping the counter. "You'd be surprised what floors keep." Daniel thumbed the token until he could feel the number without looking. There were photographs in the church office too, a corkboard of youth group snapshots, where Marisol appeared in a corner, shoulder half-cropped, gaze turned away. In one, the Reverend's hand floated near her hair, not touching, not. The wall clock in the background read 9:13 or maybe 3:46, the minute hand blurred like a struck bell. Daniel stared until the numbers wouldn't settle. He told himself it was the camera. He told himself he was not bending the image to fit a hole inside him. Finally, beneath the bench behind the high school, the one with the carved hearts and carved obscenities and a carved eternity he once pretended to believe in, Daniel found the missing piece of the locket's torn photograph. It had slipped between slats and scabbed itself with dirt. He rinsed it in the bathroom sink, the water like a thin whisper. The other face came back slowly. His, younger, mouth a careless curve around a cigarette. Two profiles in a hinge, turned toward each other as if in perpetual apology. He pressed the fragment into the locket with the kind of care that feels like trespass. The pattern that rose from these objects wasn't a timeline so much as a pulse. 9:13, County Road 13, ride once, remember always, I'm not a picture, a hand that doesn't touch, a laughter that refuses capture. The clues clarified and then fogged as though the truth were breathing. Each item reflected Daniel back at himself in a slightly different angle. The Polaroids accused him of wanting a souvenir. The diary accused him of mistaking reflection for intimacy. The token accused him of riding a memory again and again, until the horse beneath it went lame. Even the number accused him, tracing a route through town that led nowhere except to the part of his head where obsession keeps its desk lamp on. Me started keeping her own notebook, a neat ledger where she wrote observations and left spaces for things she didn't want to name. We need corroboration, she said, but her voice thinned when she held the diary page. Lulu stopped answering the bell when the door opened, letting patrons call out for coffee to empty air. Isla folded the locket's photograph this way and that, as if testing whether it could be made to hold a different face. The Reverend recorded a sermon about the danger of images and the hunger to be seen. Idols, he said, are shadows you can touch. Daniel felt the word idol crawl over his skin. He did not go back to church the next Sunday. In the evenings, he arranged the objects on his kitchen table, Polaroids in a row, token at the center, diary page weightless as a threat, and watched the light change across them. Shadows lengthened and softened, meaning did too. He turned off the lamp and sat in the room's watery dark. This, he thought, is how truth moves, like a figure behind glass, visible only when your own face dims. He tried not to speak to the objects, but sometimes did, a whisper to a diary line, an apology told to a brass coin. The apartment answered in the small mechanical ways buildings do, a refrigerator hum, a pipe's dry swallow. He dreamed of aisle seats and chalk dust and someone's breath caught on an unfinished word. He woke with the taste of metal and the sense that the locket's hinge had opened on its own in the night. What the pattern revealed was a shape that could be read as confession or coincidence. Daniel chose, then unchose, and chose again. The mind, he learned, is a carousel with a single horse and a single song. You circle until you believe motion is destination. 6. Twist questions investigators' perception, blurring truth and delusion. It happened on a Wednesday that smelled like rain but refused to give it. Daniel stood in the church hallway, staring at the youth room's bulletin board, which he had stared at before, twice, 3 times. He felt the peculiar vertigo of repetition, the way a familiar corridor can tilt if you walk it enough times in a state of hunger. Me was down the hall, speaking softly with a parishioner. The Reverend's office door was closed, the frosted pane a square of milk. Daniel lifted a Polaroid he'd already catalogued, a group of teenagers on folding chairs, knees raw from summer. There it was again, the clock, the blur, the hand not touching. He reached forward and found his fingers shaking. He told himself to stop. He told himself to breathe. Instead, he felt the old ache move through his body, the ache that says, "If I can just see it right, I can forgive myself for not seeing it then." A dizziness turned. The corridor lengthened. He caught a reflection in the glass of a fire extinguisher case, himself older, jaw locked, eyes narrowed to needles, and for a second he misrecognized the face as a stranger's watching him. The sensation was so complete he actually nodded to it. He imagined that stranger whispering, "You know, don't you?" A ridiculous thought, but it arrived with the finality of a gavel. He swallowed and went to the Reverend's office. Cole looked up, kind concern sliding into place like a practiced frame. "Daniel," he said, "you look." "Where were you at 9:13?" Daniel asked. "The night she disappeared." Cole's smile went fragile. "That was more than 2 decades. "Your office," Daniel said, voice thin and dangerous even to him. "You kept counseling notes, Polaroids from retreats, a safe for valuables." He couldn't be sure about the safe. He had dreamed it last night and woken certain it existed. The Reverend's eyes flicked to the bookshelf. A tick. Or not, Daniel moved before permission could deny him. He ran his palm along the spines until it caught on the edge of a panel too stiff to belong. A cabinet opened, a plain metal box fitted into the wall containing envelopes labeled with months, years, names. The sight staggered him. Relief first, hot and dizzying, the world answering back. Then fear just as pure. What if I made this? He did not trust the sequence by which he had arrived here. Clues that glowed only in proximity to his need. Mi's footsteps sounded in the hall. She entered, stopped at the threshold, looked from the open cabinet to Daniel's hand to the Reverend's face. "Sir," she said, but it was a question for both men. Cole inhaled, slow, a man about to interpret his life. "Those are donation records," he began. But the first envelope Daniel touched was not. Inside, a curled Polaroid, the youth room, the same folding chairs, the same blurring clock. And there, seated 3 rows back, Marisol, her head turned. The flash had caught the wet shine at her eye's corner. She was either crying or the light had invented a tear and placed it there for the story to eat. On the bottom border, a different hand than before had written a verse reference. Daniel didn't read it. He read the clock, 9:13 or 3:46. He could no longer tell. The numbers braided, the room seemed to tilt. He felt something break in his idea of himself. An investigator assembles facts. A penitent assembles evidence of his guilt. The second can wear the first like a mask until the face underneath forgets how to move. He heard a sound in the office that might have been a drawer or his heart. Mi's breath shortened. The Reverend reached to steady himself on the desk, which trembled in sympathy. "Sir," Mi said again, softer, and stepped forward to take the envelope. Procedure reasserted itself in her posture. She photographed, bagged, catalogued. Daniel stood useless as weather. He could not tell if he discovered something or conjured it from the fog of his wanting. Even the memory of last night's dream, the safe behind the books, felt like a thumb pressed into wax the day before a seal is cast. The search turned up more photographs, none criminal in isolation, all incriminating in arrangement. Girls at church events, hands almost touching, glances that might be fear or shyness or the camera's lie. A second diary page surfaced later, this one in a donation box. "If I disappear, check the places men are saints." It could be Marisol's hand. Or not. The M swooped the same way, or close enough to be an echo. An arrest warrant followed because the world demands paperwork when it senses danger, and because Mi believed in sequences that don't require ghosts. Reverend Cole was led from the church in a soft rain that finally committed to falling. People gathered on the steps with their mouths open around the word no. Flashbulbs sneezed what was left of the light. The town inhaled in shock. The man who married them, baptized them, told them where to put their sorrow, shackled by 2 quiet deputies who did not meet his eyes. Daniel stood in the back, unable to tell whether the thunder he heard was weather or the collapse of a cathedral he'd built in his head. He wanted to vomit, to pray, to sleep for a year, to reopen the safe and find it empty so he could be returned to the freedom of not knowing. Instead, he watched the doors close on the squad car, the glass briefly mirroring his face and then refusing it. For a moment, no more, he saw Marisol seated beside the Reverend, calm, the way the dead sometimes look in dreams when they come to reassure the living. She said nothing. He told himself she shook her head. He told himself she didn't. Both memories took root. The twist, if there was one, did not change the facts so much as rearrange their furniture. It put the couch against the window and the bed on the wrong wall. Daniel walked through the room of his mind and kept bumping his shin. He could no longer tell whether he'd followed a trail Marisol left or a pattern he projected onto any surface that would hold ink. The arrest shocked the community. It did not absolve the detective. The mirror he'd been polishing turned and showed him a face he didn't believe or a face he'd always known. He couldn't decide which was worse. 7. Ending feels haunting and unresolved. Truth brings no peace. They called it closure on the evening news, graphics, a banner, something bright declaring the darkness solved. The phrase tasted like a penny in Daniel's mouth. Evidence would be tested, statements taken, dates unspooled and rewound. Courtrooms would manufacture order as best they could. People in town spoke in murmurs outside grocery stores and in louder whispers at backyard grills. Isla stopped answering her phone and started lighting 2 candles instead of 1. Lulu left the diner door unlocked, as if the hour might walk back in by mistake. Me filled out forms with the small, unromantic heroism of a person who believes the work should matter regardless of how it feels. Daniel drove at night to the places where sound thins. County Road 13, the fairground skeleton. The gas station peeled to its studs. He parked without turning off the engine, the car's low idle a mechanical heartbeat he borrowed. The sky above Texas was whatever it always is, too big to carry your secrets and too remote to care they're heavy. He practiced imagining Marisol walking out of the dark, 17 forever, asking for forgiveness and refusing it in the same breath. He practiced imagining himself as a man who had done his duty. Neither image held. He visited Isla one last time with the locket cleaned and the photograph mended as if time could be wooed by glue. He placed it in her palm and felt an old, unnameable heat move across his skin. "I found this," he said. She nodded, no surprise, as though the locket had merely toured the town and returned home tired. "Do you want me to keep it?" he asked. Isla looked up for the first time in the conversation. "Want?" she said, and the word dropped between them like a coin into a well that had been dry for years. She closed her fingers around the chain. "You can go now," she added, not unkindly. He stood on the porch a minute after the door shut, listening to the house breathe. In court months later, witnesses would say things that fit together if you wanted them to. The photos were suggestive. The diary pages rhymed. A pastor's kindness had edges. A girl's laughter had traps. But that was a smaller theater, and this ending did not happen there. It happened in the shallow present where Daniel's memory and desire colluded. He returned to the abandoned house on County Road 13 and stepped into the cold that had preserved it. The board spoke. The ceiling peeled. The clock that had stopped still implied time. He walked from room to room with the care of a trespasser who suspects he is also an heir. In the corner where he'd first seen the half-burned photograph, he crouched and pressed his hand flat to the floorboards. The wood tasted of iron in the air. He whispered, "I'm sorry," a sentence that has never solved anything, and yet sometimes serves as the only bridge across a void. The house did what houses do. It kept standing. Outside, the wind pushed the grass in one direction and then lost interest. Daniel sat on the stoop with his coat closed to his throat. He let the world be larger than his understanding and smaller than his regret. A truck went by on the distant highway, a sound like a long breath let out and not pulled back in. He thought of Reverend Cole in a cell, a man who might be guilty, might be innocent, might be both by turns depending on how you told the story. He thought of me at her desk, writing a report that would outlast them all. He thought of Lulu counting change, of Thomas folding himself into work, of Isla with a locket in her fist. He thought of Marisol at 17, walking away from a fairground in shoes too thin for the gravel, a brass token in her pocket that read "Ride once, remember always." When the dark settled fully, he realized the thing he had known and refused. He had solved the case only insofar as he had drawn a shape around it and named the shape an answer. He could live inside it. Other people could hang coats on its corners. But the wild core of it, the exact voltage of that summer night, the precise angle of the glance between fear and refusal, the true measure of his own failure, remained offstage, speaking in the older language of silence. Some part of him had arrested the pastor to arrest himself, to bring an end to motion. Some other part had sought the truth as clean water. Both parts sat now in the cold, shivering in a body that would forget nothing and misremember half. He stood and walked to the road. The gravel sounded like small bones under his shoes. In the distance, a dog barked twice and then changed its mind. Daniel looked up and found a neutral sky. He could have prayed, instead he listened. To the field, to the house, to the wide, patient quiet. There are nights when the closest thing to peace is the decision not to demand it. He turned toward town eventually, not because anything waiting there could heal him, but because people still needed things done for them, and his hands, clumsy with guilt, accurate with procedure, knew how to sign forms and carry boxes and pour coffee into paper cups. He would visit Me's office and sit without talking until she looked up and said, "We did what we could," which would be both true and inadequate. He would stop at the diner and leave quarters on the counter without taking change. He would drive past Isla's porch and keep going, because sometimes mercy is the promise not to knock. Behind him, the abandoned house continued to breathe. In some rooms, dust kept the shapes of departed objects as if expecting their return. A clock with no pulse marked nothing. Somewhere a photo waited under a floorboard for fingers that would not seek it again. The wind moved through the ribs of the place, an anatomy of air, and carried a name that was not quite a sound. Marisol. The syllables dissolved before they reached the road. He walked on. The night did not bless him or curse him. It accepted him the way a lake accepts a thrown stone, without comment, with ripples that are not quite an answer and not quite a question, widening until they refuse to be seen. Peace did not arrive. The case was over. The residue stayed.